Magic did not make beautiful things. How could it? Raw chaos was not known for its subtlety, and that's all magic was, madness and energy. A corruption that ran deep along the soul of the world, entropy itself. But tools don't need to be beautiful to be useful. A mage would always break under the strain of such power, but they could move mountains before the final crack. Elves could trade their eons for centuries, and dwarves their centuries for decades. And humans, very rarely, could trade their decades for years. But such trades were rare indeed, for it took a genius to compress the great work into such a short period. There had been a few over the centuries, but most were still learning the simplest of tricks when the bitter end came for them. And it was always a bitter end. Magic poisoning trickled into everything, dosing out a toxic melange of maladies. Cancers commingled with infections as metabolic errors mixed with the ravages of time. Froth-filled lungs choking out desperate gasps were as common as great fungating tumours, tearing their way out of the body in a twisting facsimile of birth. It would be too generous to say that many mages died screaming. The truth was, most did. Nearly all. They died terrible deaths, and they lived terrible lives, rotting from within, as they channeled the end of all things through their bodies. Their spines bent into arched curves, and their skin greyed, and their eyes turned bloodshot as the blood leaked from every capillary. Just before the end, their whole body was stained the way their eyes did, like spiderwebs etched in blood. Silas had been stained that way for the last century of his life. It was a mystery how he lingered on, eking out misery and power in equal fortunes. To sit there in the moment of his death, at the apex of his power, without teetering one way or the other. It was certainly a way to be among the most powerful magi in a myriad. It was a testament to the depth of his suffering, that even in a cohort as envious as the scholars of Rot, there were none that dared follow in his footsteps. A better object lesson about the cost of power could not be found. His veins leaked, half empty. His skin sagged and tore in some places, stretching hideously in others. He festered, undying, undead, twisted and knotted with disease and madness alike. But a better man for holding the line would not be found. He'd been standing in the centre of the bridge, watching his cloaked opponent draw closer for almost 10 minutes now. He was patient for a dying man, but he'd been dying for almost a century now. He knew he had time to wait. More time than he had patience for walking, at least. His body was twisted from misuse, better at acting as a conduit for raw power than it was for movement. Walking hurt. Standing hurt less. His vision had spent the centuries fading away with the rest of him. The shape was familiar, even when it was at the far end of the bridge. But it wasn't until the man had moved within 40 steps that features could be made out. Healthy skin, pale, but in a way that suggested scholarship instead of sickness. Hair that grew in a shining golden crown, thick and unruly. Silas had only met one acolyte that had kept their hair past the harrowing. A human from 4 centuries before. And suddenly, impossibly, Silas recognized the man in front of him. "Holloway," he said, in lieu of greeting. This had been a ritual between them once, a dumb joke that they kicked back and forth in all those years ago. "No," the man replied warmly, hands already gesturing to the space around them. "Not a hallway, a bridge." He'd made that joke the first time they'd met, in this very place. The lone bridge from the Twilight Isles. It was also the last place he'd seen him. Back, fading into the mists, he journeyed home to join the fight against the necromancer of Mithrain. In a kingdom 200,000 strong, only a few dozen had survived. He'd barely been an acolyte when he left. The stupid fool had never stood a chance. How had he... Silas's thoughts were interrupted by a dawning awareness that something had gone wrong. He could feel the ambient levels of magic drop. He'd felt this before, watching teams of war mages work in tandem. Even he couldn't manage it alone. His mastery could come from doing more with less. One man doing this was like drinking away the rising tide, eating a cow without spitting out bones. Madness. And there was only one person in sight that could be the cause. He dodged instinctually. There was no telling what hit the spot where he stood before. It wasn't comprehensible to the mortal mind. Mana bolts were seen by the gaps they left in the world around them. But the places that one's mind slid away from, no matter how hard one tried. Even Silas had never managed to form one by himself. Flames roared to life along both sides of the bridge. The old elf's back heaved under the strain of the channel, even as he curled the flames into each other, forming a quarter-league long arch of fire. Then he compressed it. The threat of it was enough to interrupt the second bolt from forming. The elf had been expecting a counterattack, but his old friend seemed to be a little more cautious than that. He felt a wall of mana clash against his own, probing for the artery that connected him to the inferno. He pushed back, drove his mind like a sharpened spike into the consciousness probing against him. Memories bled back, strange ones, theorems on the nature of magic, on the nature of death. Gradients directing the flow of soul towards something deep and dark. Holloway winced. The move would have broken a lesser man, but his mind was as incorruptible as his flesh. Silas felt something clamp around him, and he realized that the weak spot he'd found was intentional. A ruse. The link he held in the physical world, the thing that connected him to the fire, tore without breaking. The spell flared out silently. He was dead. He stared defiantly, and was confused to see something gentle looking back. "If I wanted you dead, I would have turned back and waited," Holloway said, not unkindly. "I have time. More time than anyone." Mana flowed up the still-trapped conduit, burning and bright. Silas was used to feeling it corrode him, feed into the cancers and sores that had taken root in his body over centuries of abuse. But this was different. It burned, but in the way that fire did. The rot drank it, and instead of corrupting him, it corrupted itself. Silas could feel the horrible beauty of it, of cancers blossoming within cancers, of immobas blighting his infections. It was like witnessing death fall upon its own scythe. It was so obvious now that he could feel it. The decay of his body wasn't truly death, but an extant form of life. From the minute forms that swam in his pus, to the root-like cancer nodules that grew under his skin, he wasn't a fallow field. He was teeming with life, drowning in it. If absorbing magic is what spawned this in him, it would feel the same once it drank deep of the same cup. It was beautiful. The cure was in the poison. Of course it was. Life flowed in the gradient of death, and magic flowed with the gradient of life. He just needed to stop fighting it. He looked in wonder at his friend, struggled not to writhe with the venom burning itself out of his body. Holloway walked carefully up to him, laying a hand across his burning brow. "We shared memories through the link you made. I think you saw the steps I took, learning how to live long enough to become the new necromancer of Mithrain. But I saw you vowing to save the world from the end of all life, and from preventing another Ithin from happening. You remembered me." Silas couldn't answer. It had been so long since living felt harder than dying. "I am the new necromancer of Mithrain, but I am not here to be the end of life. I am here to kill death itself, to set the serpent upon its tail. 10 years it took to learn how to save myself, 400 more to learn how to save the living, and now, at last, I can save the dead." He looked across the bridge, towards his homeworld of Athane. The tomb state of stone and bone and ancient loss. He was remembering something, and for the first time since he'd gone through his harrowing, for the first time since the seed of rot had been planted in his heart, Silas imagined a world where magic could make something beautiful.